The encounter. The sun was relentless over the city of Horizon Springs, casting a golden haze over its towering skyline and bustling streets. Inside the opulent granite-lined walls of Pinnacle Financial, a prestigious banking institution, the atmosphere was both serene and calculated. The rhythmic clatter of keyboards, hushed conversations, and the occasional ring of a phone filled the vast space. Among the throng of customers and employees moving about, the bank manager, Richard Carmichael, stood near the central counter. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp jawline and an ever-present air of authority. Richard's tailored gray suit and immaculate appearance mirrored the pristine decor of the bank. Known for his perfectionism, he was also infamous for his rigidity and unyielding demeanor. The morning's routine was proceeding smoothly until the glass doors swung open, and a man entered. He was striking, tall with a confident posture, wearing a tailored midnight blue suit and polished shoes. His presence exuded poise, and his every step commanded attention. He carried no briefcase or documents, only a simple black leather wallet tucked discreetly into his jacket. This man was Elijah Harrington. Despite his composed exterior, Elijah had grown accustomed to how people viewed him. In many spaces, he was just another face, another person to judge, dismiss, or underestimate. But this time, the stakes were higher, and Elijah had come prepared. He walked up to the nearest teller, a young woman who seemed slightly flustered by his presence. Her name tag read Angela, and her kind eyes darted nervously as Elijah smiled warmly. "Good morning," Elijah said, his voice smooth and assured. "I'd like to make a withdrawal, please." Angela nodded quickly, her fingers already poised over her keyboard. "Of course, sir. May I see your ID and account information?" Elijah reached into his jacket, pulled out a sleek card holder, and handed over his identification. Angela glanced at the ID and started entering the information when a sharp voice cut through the air. "I'll handle this." The voice belonged to Richard Carmichael, who approached the counter briskly, his polished shoes echoing on the marble floor. His hawk-like eyes scanned Elijah, taking in the expensive suit and calm demeanor. But his lips curled into a tight, condescending smile, betraying an immediate judgment. "Good morning," Richard said, though his tone lacked the warmth the greeting implied. "What seems to be the issue here?" Angela hesitated, unsure whether to continue assisting Elijah. Before she could respond, Richard leaned closer to the counter. "Sir," Richard addressed Elijah directly, "I'll need to see your identification myself. We have very strict protocols, and I must ensure everything checks out." Elijah raised an eyebrow but complied, sliding his ID across the counter. Richard picked it up, scrutinizing it longer than necessary. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes flicking between the card and Elijah. "This is quite an unusual transaction request," Richard began, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "What exactly are you withdrawing funds for today?" Elijah's expression remained calm, though his voice carried an unmistakable firmness. "That's my business, not yours. I believe the ID and account details should suffice." Richard bristled, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. "Sir," he said, his voice louder now, ensuring nearby employees and customers could hear, "our policies are in place for a reason. I'll need additional verification before proceeding." Elijah studied Richard for a moment, his gaze steady and unnerving. "And if I don't provide additional verification, what happens then?" Richard leaned back, crossing his arms. "Then, I'm afraid I won't be able to process your request. Fraud is a serious issue, and I have to protect the bank." The tension in the room was palpable now. Customers stopped their transactions to glance at the unfolding scene, their whispers barely audible. Employees behind the counters exchanged uneasy looks, unsure whether to intervene. Elijah exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "So, you're refusing to serve me?" "I'm following procedure," Richard shot back. "If you don't have what's required, I suggest you return when you do." Elijah tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Procedure or something else? The question lingered in the air like a storm cloud, and for a fleeting moment, Richard faltered. His face hardened again, though his confidence now seemed forced. Before Richard could respond, Elijah pulled out his phone. With a few quick swipes, he made a call. "Yes, this is Elijah Harrington," he said into the receiver, his voice calm but commanding. "I'm at Pinnacle Financial. There seems to be an issue. Could you send someone down to sort it out?" Richard stiffened, his frown deepening. "What exactly are you trying to do here, sir?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Elijah smiled faintly, tucking his phone back into his pocket. "I'm ensuring clarity." "Clarity," Richard repeated, his voice rising slightly. "If you think you can intimidate us—" "I don't need to intimidate anyone," Elijah interrupted, his tone sharp now. "I'm simply holding you accountable." Richard opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, the glass doors swung open again, and a man in a dark suit entered. His demeanor was calm yet commanding, and he walked directly to Elijah, ignoring the confused stares of everyone in the room. "Elijah," the man said warmly, extending his hand. "I came as soon as I could." "Thank you, Martin," Elijah replied, shaking his hand firmly. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding." The color drained from Richard's face as he processed what was happening. Who are you?" he stammered, addressing the newcomer. Martin turned to Richard, his expression cool. "I'm Martin Ellis, Chief Operating Officer of Pinnacle Financial. And this," he gestured to Elijah, "is Elijah Harrington, the majority shareholder of this bank." The room fell silent. The weight of the revelation hit like a thunderclap. Employees froze, customers exchanged wide-eyed glances, and Richard's face turned ghostly pale. Elijah stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Richard. "You've just refused service to the owner of the very institution you claim to protect." Richard stammered, his earlier arrogance completely shattered. I didn't realize." "That's the problem," Elijah interrupted, his voice cold. "You didn't bother to realize. You made an assumption, a dangerous one." Martin cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "Mr. Harrington, how would you like to proceed?" Elijah's gaze didn't waver from Richard. "We'll discuss this here. I think everyone should hear what I have to say." The room was still as Elijah's words echoed, promising a reckoning that no one present would soon forget. A lesson in assumptions. The air in the bank felt heavy, thick with the collective tension of employees, customers, and the now visibly flustered bank manager, Richard Carmichael. Elijah Harrington, calm and poised, stood as the epicenter of this unexpected upheaval. Around him, heads turned, whispers spread like wildfire, and eyes darted nervously between him and Richard. Elijah allowed the silence to linger, his calm demeanor acting as a stark contrast to Richard's unraveling composure. Slowly, he turned to Martin Ellis, the COO who had just introduced Elijah's true identity to the room. "Martin," Elijah began, his voice smooth but carrying an edge. "Before we proceed, let me ask you something. What is the purpose of this institution?" Martin, always diplomatic, straightened his tie. "Pinnacle Financial exists to serve our customers with respect, integrity, and fairness," he replied, his words practiced yet sincere. "Exactly," Elijah said, turning his attention back to Richard. "Respect, integrity, fairness. Those words are the foundation of this bank. Yet today, I've been given a front-row seat to how easily they can be discarded." Richard opened his mouth, desperate to defend himself. "Sir, I assure you, this was all a misunderstanding. I was merely following protocol." Elijah raised a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. "Protocol, you say?" he repeated, his tone measured but piercing. "Tell me, Richard, at what point in your protocol did you decide that I wasn't deserving of the same respect as the other customers here?" Richard hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the employees and customers who were now openly watching him. It wasn't about respect, Mr. Harrington. I was simply ensuring security measures were met. Fraud is fraud." Elijah interrupted, his voice rising slightly for the first time. And what about me suggested fraud to you, Richard? Was it my suit, my demeanor, or was it simply my face? The question landed like a hammer, reverberating through the room. A low murmur rippled among the customers. Some nodded subtly, recognizing the deeper implications of Elijah's words. Richard flushed, his hands gripping the counter as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. I didn't mean it that way. But that's exactly what you meant, Elijah said, cutting him off again. His voice softened, but it carried an undeniable weight. You looked at me and made a decision before I even spoke a word. That's not protocol, Richard. That's prejudice. Richard's jaw tightened, his earlier bravado now entirely gone. He looked down, unable to meet Elijah's gaze. Elijah stepped closer to the counter, his eyes never leaving Richard. Let me tell you a story, he began, his tone conversational yet commanding. When I was a young man, just starting out, I went into a bank much like this one. I had just secured my first major contract and was ready to open an account. But do you know what happened? Richard didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. The rest of the room leaned in, captivated by Elijah's measured storytelling. I was turned away, Elijah continued. The manager there didn't believe I had the money I claimed. He didn't believe I could be a serious client. Why? Because I didn't fit the image he had in his mind. He assumed I didn't belong. The weight of Elijah's words hung in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone present. Even the young teller, Angela, looked down at her hands, visibly moved. That moment, Elijah said, stayed with me. Not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. It was one of many experiences where I was reminded that people like me are often judged not for who we are, but for what others perceive us to be. Elijah paused, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in before continuing. That experience taught me two things. First, it taught me the pain of being dismissed, of having your worth questioned. And second, it taught me the power of creating spaces where everyone is treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance or background. He straightened, his presence commanding the room. That's why I invested in this institution. I wanted Pinnacle Financial to be a place where people are valued for their potential, not judged for their differences. The silence in the bank was now absolute, the only sound the faint hum of air conditioning. Richard looked up, his face pale, his lips trembling as he tried to find the words to respond. I didn't mean, he began, but Elijah stopped him with a firm look. This isn't just about you, Richard, Elijah said. It's about the culture we create and the biases we allow to fester. Your actions today were a symptom of a larger problem, one that needs addressing immediately. Elijah turned to Martin. Martin, what is our current policy on sensitivity training for employees? Martin hesitated, caught off guard by the direct question. We have optional training sessions available for employees, he said cautiously. Optional. Elijah repeated, his voice carrying a sharp edge. That ends today. From this moment forward, sensitivity and bias training will be mandatory for all employees, from tellers to executives. And I want those trainings to be thorough and ongoing. Martin nodded quickly. Understood, Mr. Harrington. I'll ensure it's implemented across all branches. Good, Elijah said, his tone softening slightly. He turned back to Richard. As for you, Richard, you'll be stepping down as manager of this branch, effective immediately. Richard's eyes widened in shock. Mr. Harrington, please. This isn't a punishment, Richard, Elijah interrupted. It's an opportunity for reflection. Take this time to understand the impact of your actions, not just on me, but on every customer who has walked through these doors. Only then can you truly grow. Richard looked down, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his own failures. I understand, he said quietly. Elijah nodded, satisfied. He turned to the employees, his gaze sweeping across the room. To the rest of you, he said, let this be a reminder. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. That is not just a policy, it's a standard, and I expect each of you to uphold it." The employees nodded solemnly, some looking visibly moved. Even Angela, the young teller, seemed inspired by Elijah's words. Finally, Elijah addressed the customers. "To everyone here," he said, his voice warm but firm, "thank you for your patience today. I hope this serves as a reminder that change starts with accountability. And I promise you, Pinnacle Financial will strive to be better." With that, Elijah stepped back, his presence still commanding but no longer confrontational. Martin moved forward, his tone professional yet deferential. "Mr. Harrington, I'll personally oversee the implementation of the changes you've outlined." Elijah nodded. "Thank you, Martin. I'll be following up to ensure they're carried out effectively." As Elijah turned to leave, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Customers and employees alike exchanged looks, their expressions a mixture of admiration and introspection. And as Elijah walked out of the bank, the echoes of his words lingered, leaving an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed the day's events. The ripple effect. The events inside Pinnacle Financial's main branch did not remain confined to the polished granite walls. By the time Elijah Harrington left the building, the whispers had spread, and the echoes of his confrontation with Richard Carmichael had begun rippling through the bank's employees, customers, and beyond. The employees' reckoning. Inside the break room, a group of employees huddled together, their earlier tasks forgotten. Angela, the young teller who had initially assisted Elijah, sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her mind replayed every moment of the interaction she'd witnessed, especially Elijah's words about dignity and respect. "I can't believe what just happened," whispered Karen, one of the senior tellers. "Richard's been here for years. Who would have thought he'd misjudge someone like that?" Angela looked up, her brow furrowed. "It's not just about Richard," she said quietly. "It's about all of us. Haven't we all made assumptions about people at some point?" Karen hesitated. "Maybe, but we don't all act on them like he did." Angela pressed her lips together, unsure whether to voice what she was thinking. "I think we do, in smaller ways, like when someone walks in looking disheveled or asks too many questions. We don't always give them the same patience or respect." The room fell silent as the employees exchanged uneasy glances. Even Karen, who had worked at the bank for over a decade, found herself reflecting on her own behavior. It was an uncomfortable realization, but one they couldn't ignore. "I guess we all need to do better," muttered Rob, a junior banker who had been quietly observing. "If Mr. Harrington noticed this once, who's to say he hasn't seen it before, or that other customers haven't?" Angela nodded. "That's the point. It's not just about one person making a mistake. It's about the culture we've allowed to grow." The customers' voices. Meanwhile, in the lobby, the customers who had witnessed the confrontation lingered, their own conversations unfolding. A woman in a floral dress turned to the man standing beside her. "You know, I've had a similar experience here," she said, her voice low but tinged with frustration. "Once, when I came in after a long day at work, they barely wanted to help me until I mentioned my account balance." The man nodded. "It's not just here. It's everywhere. People see you, make up their minds about who you are, and treat you accordingly." What that man said, it hit home. Another customer, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, chimed in. "I respect him for speaking out the way he did. It wasn't about anger. It was about accountability. We need more people like that in leadership." The floral dress woman sighed. "It's just a shame it takes someone like him, someone with power, to make people listen." As the customers shared their stories, an undercurrent of both frustration and hope began to emerge. Many of them realized they weren't alone in their experiences, and that Elijah's actions had given voice to feelings they had long kept to themselves. Richard's reflections. In his office, Richard Carmichael sat alone, staring at his reflection in the dark screen of his computer monitor. The events of the day replayed in his mind, each detail sharper than the last. The way Elijah had looked at him, not with anger, but with disappointment, was what lingered most. For years, Richard had prided himself on his ability to maintain control, to run a tight ship. He saw himself as a gatekeeper, ensuring the bank's reputation remained untarnished. But now, he couldn't escape the realization that his sense of control had been warped by his own biases. 15 years, he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. And I didn't see it. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Memories surfaced, moments he had dismissed as inconsequential. The elderly man he had rushed out because he was asking too many questions. The young woman he had scrutinized because her attire didn't meet his standards. And now, Elijah Harrington, the man who owned the very institution he had been tasked with representing. Richard exhaled deeply, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. For the first time in years, he felt small, not because of his job, but because of the person he had allowed himself to become. Elijah's intentions, back in his office, located on the top floor of Pinnacle Financial's headquarters, Elijah Harrington sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the sprawling city below. The view was spectacular, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He replayed the confrontation in his mind, questioning whether he had done enough. Had he truly made his point? Would the changes he demanded create lasting impact, or would they be swept under the rug once the dust settled? A knock at the door broke his reverie. Martin Ellis entered, holding a folder and wearing his usual composed expression. "Mr. Harrington," he began, "I wanted to update you on the steps we're taking." Elijah gestured for him to sit. "Go on." "We've already started drafting the sensitivity training program you requested," Martin said, placing the folder on Elijah's desk. "I've also spoken to HR about creating a feedback channel for customers and employees to report incidents anonymously." Elijah nodded, flipping through the folder. "Good. But this can't just be about policies, Martin. It has to be about culture. That's harder to change, but it's also more important." "I understand," Martin replied. "We'll need your leadership to set the tone." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Leadership isn't just about setting the tone, Martin. It's about listening, learning, and holding ourselves accountable. I expect the same from you and everyone else in this organization." Martin nodded, his respect for Elijah growing. "I'll make sure the message is clear." As Martin left, Elijah turned back to the window. He thought of the employees, the customers, and even Richard Carmichael. He hoped that the events of the day would serve as a turning point, not just for Pinnacle Financial, but for everyone involved. A community's awakening. Word of the incident spread quickly, thanks to customers who had been present and shared their accounts online. Social media posts described the calm yet powerful way Elijah had addressed the situation, sparking discussions about bias, leadership, and accountability. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a rare example of a corporate leader taking a stand against discrimination. By the next morning, Pinnacle Financial was trending, with hashtags like #AccountabilityStartShare and #LeadershipWithIntegrity dominating conversations. But for Elijah, it wasn't about the headlines or the praise. It was about the ripple effect, the way one moment of confrontation could spark a broader dialogue, encouraging others to examine their own actions and biases. A new chapter. The following week, Pinnacle Financial issued a statement acknowledging the incident and outlining the steps they were taking to address it. The statement, signed by Elijah Harrington, emphasized the bank's commitment to creating an environment of respect and fairness for all. For Richard Carmichael, the suspension marked the beginning of a journey he hadn't anticipated. He enrolled in a series of workshops on diversity and inclusion, determined to confront the biases he had long ignored. It wasn't an easy process, but it was one he knew was necessary. For Angela and her colleagues, the incident became a turning point in their own understanding of customer service and workplace culture. They began holding informal discussions about their experiences, sharing stories, and exploring ways to improve. And for Elijah, the experience reaffirmed his belief that true leadership wasn't about wielding power, It was about using it to inspire change. As he walked into a meeting with his executive team, he carried with him the conviction that the events at the bank were only the beginning. The real work, he knew, was just beginning. The long shadows of change. The week following the confrontation at Pinnacle Financial had been anything but ordinary. What began as a seemingly routine day for many had evolved into a transformative moment for an institution, its employees, and its community. While the public and media celebrated Elijah Harrington's leadership and integrity, the deeper effects of the incident unfolded behind closed doors, casting long shadows that would challenge and redefine those involved. Richard Carmichael's journey of accountability. Richard Carmichael sat in his modest suburban home, a mug of untouched coffee cooling on the table in front of him. The man who had once confidently commanded respect as a bank manager now wrestled with a stark new reality. He had been suspended, and his professional future hung in the balance. His wife, Marjorie, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You'll find your way through this, Richard," she said softly, but her words barely registered. Richard's thoughts churned relentlessly, circling back to Elijah Harrington's words. "You looked at me and made a decision before I even spoke a word." The memory of those words felt like a stone lodged in his chest. The next morning, Richard attended his first mandated sensitivity training session. Held in a plain conference room downtown, the session was led by a facilitator named Linda, a calm yet assertive woman who introduced herself as someone who had spent her career addressing systemic bias and unconscious prejudice. "Bias isn't just overt racism or sexism," Linda explained to the group. "It's the small, often unspoken assumptions we make. These assumptions might seem harmless, but they can ripple outward, affecting lives, opportunities, and trust." Richard sat stiffly in the back, uncomfortable but listening. As Linda guided the group through exercises designed to reveal unconscious biases, Richard began to see reflections of himself in the examples she provided. A role-playing scenario hit particularly close to home. A bank manager refusing service to a young black entrepreneur based on policy concerns. The scenario mirrored his own actions so precisely that his palms began to sweat. By the end of the session, Richard remained in his seat as others filed out. Linda approached him, her expression gentle but firm. "You seem to have a lot on your mind," she said. "I do," Richard admitted, his voice low. "I spent my whole career believing I was fair and professional. But now I see how much I've overlooked, how much harm I've probably caused." Linda nodded. "Awareness is the first step, but growth requires more than acknowledgement. Are you willing to put in the work?" Richard met her gaze, determination slowly replacing his shame. "I am," he said. "I have to be." Angela and the grassroots effort. At Pinnacle Financial, Angela had become an unexpected leader among her peers. Though junior in her position, the incident with Elijah Harrington had lit a fire in her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she and her coworkers had been complicit, if not actively, then passively, in allowing a culture of bias to persist. Gathering a group of like-minded employees, Angela proposed a bold idea, creating a grassroots initiative within the branch to foster inclusion and empathy. Dubbed the Respect Project, the initiative aimed to share stories, hold regular team discussions, and brainstorm ways to improve customer interactions. During their first meeting, Angela opened up about her own experiences. "I've realized that even small actions, like brushing off a customer's concerns or assuming someone doesn't understand our processes, can make them feel invisible," she said. "We've all done it at some point, but we have the power to change that." Karen, the senior teller who had initially resisted Angela's introspection, spoke next. "I'll admit, I wasn't sure about this at first," she began. "But seeing Mr. Harrington that day made me realize how much I've overlooked. It's time we all take responsibility." Over the weeks, the Respect Project gained momentum. Employees began sharing personal stories of their own biases and moments of regret, creating a space for vulnerability and accountability. Angela worked tirelessly to ensure that these conversations translated into tangible changes, from updating how customer feedback was handled to rethinking training for new hires. Elijah's continued vision. For Elijah Harrington, the events of the previous week were only the beginning. He had long understood that real change required more than a single powerful moment. It demanded sustained effort, uncomfortable conversations, and an unwavering commitment to integrity. In a meeting with Pinnacle Financial's executive team, Elijah outlined a comprehensive plan to overhaul the bank's culture. His vision went beyond sensitivity training, calling for a fundamental restructuring of how the bank measured success. "It's not enough to focus on profits and efficiency," Elijah told the room of executives. "We need to measure the quality of our customer interactions, the trust we build in our communities, and the inclusivity of our workplace." The plan included hiring a chief diversity and inclusion officer, forming an internal task force to address bias-related issues, and partnering with local organizations to support underserved communities. Elijah also insisted on establishing a scholarship fund for young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds, ensuring that opportunities were accessible to all. Some executives hesitated, voicing concerns about the cost and logistics of these initiatives. But Elijah stood firm. "These changes aren't optional," he said. "They're an investment in our future, not just as a bank, but as a responsible member of society." The community speaks. As Pinnacle Financial began implementing Elijah's vision, the community took notice. Stories of the bank's transformation spread, attracting customers who had once felt unwelcome. Local leaders praised Elijah's efforts, inviting him to speak at town hall meetings and community events. At one such event, a woman approached Elijah after his speech. Her voice trembled as she shared her story. "I spent my whole life feeling like I didn't belong in places like your bank," she said. "But hearing what you've done, it gives me hope. Thank you for showing that change is possible." Elijah smiled warmly. "Change is always possible," he replied. "It just takes people who are willing to fight for it." A new normal. Months after the confrontation, Pinnacle Financial was no longer the same institution. The changes Elijah had envisioned were taking root, reshaping not only the bank's policies but its culture. Richard Carmichael, now reinstated in a different role, became an unexpected advocate for inclusion. His journey of accountability had transformed him into a vocal supporter of the Respect Project and a mentor for employees struggling with their own biases. Angela, buoyed by the success of her grassroots efforts, was promoted to a leadership position where she continued to champion empathy and fairness. And Elijah, though content with the progress being made, remained vigilant. He knew the work of dismantling bias and building a culture of respect was never truly finished. But as he walked through the bank's lobby one afternoon, greeted by the warm smiles of employees and customers alike, he felt a deep sense of pride. The incident that had once cast a shadow over Pinnacle Financial had become the spark for a brighter, more inclusive future, one where dignity and fairness were no longer ideals, but lived realities. Winds of transformation. Months after the confrontation that shook the walls of Pinnacle Financial, the institution was evolving in ways that no one could have predicted. The changes sparked by Elijah Harrington's decisive leadership had extended far beyond policy reforms and public statements. The transformation was now deeply embedded in the daily lives of the employees, the experiences of the customers, and the heart of the community. Richard Carmichael's rebuilding. Richard Carmichael sat at a modest desk in a training center, his role now far removed from his previous position as the manager of Pinnacle Financial's flagship branch. He had been reassigned as part of his suspension, now tasked with a project designed to repair the damage caused by his actions, developing a comprehensive bias training curriculum for new and existing employees. This was not a task Richard had sought out, but as he delved deeper into the process, he began to see it as an opportunity to rebuild not just his reputation, but himself. He spent hours studying materials, meeting with diversity and inclusion experts, and attending workshops. One afternoon, Linda, the facilitator who had led his initial sensitivity training, stopped by the training center. She watched quietly as Richard paced the room, rehearsing a presentation. "You're putting a lot of effort into this," Linda remarked, her voice warm but probing. Richard turned, startled but glad to see her. "It's important," he said simply. "I've spent too long being blind to the impact of my actions. This," he gestured to the materials around him, "is my chance to make things right." Linda smiled. "It's not just about making things right, Richard. It's about creating something better. The work you're doing now has the potential to change lives, but only if you approach it with humility and authenticity." Richard nodded, her words resonating deeply. "I've learned that leadership isn't about control or authority. It's about accountability and growth. If I can help even one person avoid the mistakes I made, then maybe this journey will have been worth it." Angela's leadership blossoms. Across town, Angela sat in a meeting room at the Pinnacle Financial headquarters, her hands clasped in front of her as she prepared to present her latest initiative to the executive board. What had started as the Respect Project at her local branch had grown into a bank-wide movement, with employees across all branches participating in discussions, workshops, and community outreach programs. Angela's growth had been nothing short of remarkable. Once a quiet teller who hesitated to speak up, she was now a respected leader whose ideas had reached the ears of even the highest-ranking executives. Today, she was pitching an ambitious idea: a mentorship program aimed at empowering employees from underrepresented backgrounds. As Angela spoke, her voice steady and confident, Elijah Harrington watched from the head of the table. He had seen many presentations in his time, but there was something about Angela's conviction that set her apart. She wasn't just proposing a program. She was advocating for a vision of equity and empowerment that resonated with Elijah's own values. When Angela finished, the room erupted in applause. Elijah leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. "Angela," he said, his voice filled with pride, "this is exactly the kind of leadership we need. Consider your proposal approved." Angela beamed, a mixture of relief and excitement washing over her. She had found her voice, and with it, the power to drive meaningful change. The customer's trust restored. In the bustling lobby of the flagship branch, customers moved with a sense of ease and confidence that had been absent months earlier. Pinnacle Financial had become more than just a bank. It was now a symbol of integrity and fairness. One such customer, an elderly man named Harold, approached the counter with a check in hand. As he waited for assistance, a young employee greeted him warmly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jacobs. How can I help you today?" Harold smiled, appreciating the genuine friendliness in the teller's tone. "Just depositing this," he said, sliding the check across the counter. As the teller processed the transaction, Harold glanced around the room. He had been banking here for decades, but in recent months, he had noticed a shift. The employees seemed more attentive, the atmosphere more welcoming. It was as if the place had come alive with purpose. "Things feel different here," Harold remarked. "Better." The teller looked up, her smile broadening. "Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. We've been working hard to make sure everyone feels valued and respected. It's important to us." Harold nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. "Well, you're doing a fine job." Elijah's vision expands. Elijah Harrington's office had become a hub of activity. Between meetings, community events, and interviews with media outlets eager to discuss Pinnacle Financial's transformation, Elijah found himself busier than ever. Yet, he remained steadfast in his commitment to the values that had guided him from the start. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah sat at his desk, reviewing a proposal for a new community investment initiative. The program, titled Pathways to Prosperity, aimed to provide financial education and resources to underserved neighborhoods, empowering residents to build wealth and achieve financial independence. Martin Ellis, the COO, entered the office, carrying a folder. "Elijah, the numbers for the last quarter are in," he said, handing over the report. You'll be pleased to know that customer satisfaction has reached an all-time high. Elijah scanned the report, a satisfied smile crossing his face. It's a good start, he said. But there's still so much more we can do. Martin nodded, understanding Elijah's relentless drive. You're building more than just a bank, Elijah. You're building a legacy. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. A legacy isn't about what you leave behind, Martin. It's about the lives you touch along the way. If Pinnacle Financial can be a force for good, then we've done our job. A community transformed. In the weeks and months that followed, the impact of Pinnacle Financial's transformation reverberated throughout the community. Local leaders praised the bank's commitment to equity and inclusion, and other institutions began to take notice, seeking to replicate its success. Customers who had once felt overlooked now felt seen. Employees who had once been disengaged now took pride in their work. And the community, once skeptical of corporate promises, began to believe in the possibility of real change. At the center of it all stood Elijah Harrington, a man whose quiet strength and unwavering integrity had sparked a movement. But Elijah knew that the credit didn't belong to him alone. It belonged to the countless individuals, like Angela, Richard, and the employees of Pinnacle Financial, who had embraced the challenge of change and risen to meet it. As Elijah walked through the bustling lobby one afternoon, he paused to greet a group of employees gathered near the entrance. Among them was Angela, her energy and enthusiasm infectious. "Thank you for leading the way," Angela said, her voice filled with gratitude. Elijah smiled, his gaze sweeping over the room. "This was never about me," he said. "It's about all of us. Together, we've proven that transformation is possible when we hold ourselves accountable and refuse to settle for anything less than respect, dignity, and fairness." And with those words, Elijah turned and walked toward the future he had worked so tirelessly to build, a future defined not by what had been, but by what could be. The new standard. As a year passed since the pivotal confrontation at Pinnacle Financial, the institution was no longer just a bank. It was a beacon of transformation. The ripple effects of Elijah Harrington's unwavering stance against bias had blossomed into a movement that transcended the bank itself. It was a story of redemption, empowerment, and the unyielding pursuit of a better tomorrow. Richard Carmichael's redemption. Richard Carmichael sat in front of a packed room of new hires. His title had changed, as had his outlook. Now, as the Director of Employee Accountability and Development, Richard had found his calling in reshaping the very culture he had once perpetuated. Standing at the podium, Richard took a deep breath before addressing the room. "When I was first assigned to lead this department, I thought it was punishment. But I've come to realize it was an opportunity to confront my own shortcomings and turn them into something meaningful." He glanced at the room, filled with eager faces. "I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here to share a story. A story about a day I made the worst mistake of my career and how that moment forced me to see the world differently." Richard recounted the events of that fateful day, not sparing himself from scrutiny. He described how his assumptions had blinded him, how his judgment had faltered, and how Elijah Harrington's grace and integrity had opened his eyes. "But this isn't just about me," Richard said, his voice steady. "It's about all of us. Every interaction we have, every assumption we make, it all matters. The question we have to ask ourselves is simple. Are we treating people with the dignity and respect they deserve?" The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. For Richard, these moments were his redemption, not because they erased his past mistakes, but because they allowed him to use those mistakes to build a brighter future. Angela's expanding influence. Angela sat in a sleek conference room at the Pinnacle Financial headquarters, surrounded by leaders from across the organization. She was no longer a teller but the vice president of culture and community engagement. Her rise within the bank had been meteoric, fueled by her relentless drive to ensure that every employee and customer felt valued. Today, Angela was presenting the latest success stories from the Respect Project, which had grown into a cornerstone of Pinnacle Financial's identity. Branches across the country had adopted the program, and the results were transformative. Customer satisfaction has increased by 25%, Angela said, pointing to a graph on the screen behind her. But this isn't just about numbers. It's about the stories behind them. She clicked to the next slide, which featured testimonials from customers and employees. One read, "For the first time, I feel like I belong when I walk into the bank." Another said, "Working here has given me a new understanding of what it means to respect others." Angela turned to the room, her eyes bright with determination. "This is the impact we're making, but we can't stop here. Our goal isn't just to be a better bank. It's to set a new standard for what businesses can and should be." The executives around the table nodded, their expressions a mix of admiration and resolve. Elijah Harrington, seated at the head of the table, smiled. "Angela," he said, "you've turned an idea into a movement. This is exactly the kind of leadership we need." Elijah's vision reaches new heights. For Elijah, the transformation of Pinnacle Financial was just the beginning. He had always believed that businesses had the power and the responsibility to drive positive change. Now he was ready to take that belief to the next level. In a meeting with community leaders, Elijah unveiled his latest initiative, the Harrington Foundation for Equity and Opportunity. The foundation would focus on providing financial literacy programs, small business grants, and mentorship opportunities for underserved communities. "This isn't charity," Elijah said, addressing the room. "This is about empowerment. It's about breaking down the barriers that prevent people from reaching their full potential." The initiative was met with enthusiasm, and partnerships with local organizations quickly formed. Elijah's vision was clear: a world where everyone, regardless of their background, had the tools and support they needed to thrive. The community's embrace. In the neighborhoods surrounding Pinnacle Financial's branches, the changes were tangible. The bank had launched mobile units to bring financial services to underserved areas, held free workshops on budgeting and investing, and sponsored local events that celebrated diversity and inclusion. At one such event, a block party in a historically marginalized neighborhood, Elijah walked through the crowd, shaking hands and listening to stories. One young man approached him, holding a notebook filled with business ideas. "Mr. Harrington," the man said, his voice nervous but eager, "I've been saving up to start my own business, but I don't know where to begin. The workshops you've sponsored have taught me so much, but I was wondering if—" "Let's talk," Elijah said, cutting him off with a warm smile. He led the young man to a nearby table, where they spent the next hour discussing his ideas and mapping out a plan. By the end of their conversation, the man's eyes were filled with hope. "Thank you," he said. "No one's ever taken the time to help me like this." Elijah shook his hand firmly. "Your success is our success," he said. "Keep working hard, and remember, you're not alone." A new legacy. As the sun set on another bustling day at Pinnacle Financial, Elijah stood in the lobby of the flagship branch, watching as employees and customers interacted with warmth and respect. The transformation he had envisioned was now a reality. Angela joined him, a stack of reports in her hands. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice filled with pride. "We have," Elijah agreed. "But the work is never done. Every day is a chance to do better." Angela nodded, understanding the truth of his words. "What you've built here is remarkable, Elijah. It's not just a bank anymore. It's a symbol of what's possible." Elijah smiled, his gaze sweeping over the room. "It's not what I've built. It's what we've built, together." And with that, Elijah stepped into the future, ready to continue the journey he had started. A journey of accountability, transformation, and the unwavering belief that respect and dignity were not just ideals to strive for, but the foundation of everything worth building.